From Battleborn Progress, this is Out in Front. I'm your host, Jacob Solis. This week, we bring you our third and final installment of our series of interviews on Project 2025, what many have called the blueprint for a second Trump administration. In our first two episodes, we sat down with a half dozen subject matter experts to help break down some of the specifics of Project 2025 and dig into why those specifics matter. If you want to catch up, you can find all of it linked on our Facebook and YouTube pages. But this week, we're coming at it from a different angle. How did Project 2025 come to exist in the first place? And how likely is it that a second Trump administration would actually be able to accomplish what Project 2025 wants to do? Those are big questions, so we brought in some help from Media Matters for America, a progressive nonprofit research and information hub dedicated to monitoring conservative misinformation online for the last 2 decades. With all that out of the way, let's get to the rest of the show. Joining us now is Julie Millican, the Vice President of Media Matters for America. Julie, thanks so much for being on Out in Front.
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
Well, thanks for being here. And you know what? Let's just jump right into it. I think, for the viewers at home, for the last couple of weeks, we've been talking about some of the specific policy proposals of Project 2025. But for this conversation, I think it's helpful to take the 40,000-foot view. And I think to start, Project 2025 as like a policy platform is not necessarily, it's unique in a lot of ways, and maybe the ways that it's like odious and bad policy, but it's not unique in like existing. There are other think tanks that have made other policy platforms for candidates or presidents in the past. So how do we put Project 2025 in the context of that? I guess what makes Project 2025 different than what came before it?
Well, Project 2025 is different in that it is just the people behind it are incredibly influential and have a track record for success. Now, Project 2025 is an offshoot of the Heritage Foundation, which is a really influential right-wing think tank. What they did is they put out this policy proposal on this 900-page document called the Mandate for Leadership, which outlines basically all of these different various policy proposals that an incoming Republican administration could take. This in and of itself is not actually new. The Heritage Foundation does this every single presidential election cycle going back to Ronald Reagan. But what is new and different about this one is that they signed on with over 100 different conservative partner organizations to endorse and support these proposals. There is just an incredible amount of overlap between former Trump administration officials and the people who were involved with crafting these policy agendas. And it's really written with the intent purpose of being able to be implemented on day one, and with the full support of the right-wing movement behind it. And so that's what really gives this one is something that's a little bit even more above and beyond what the Heritage Foundation has put out previously. And I also just want to reference the Heritage Foundation has a track record of success here. Like they have consistently gotten the majority of their Mandate for Leadership proposals implemented by incoming Republican administrations, again, going back to Reagan. In the first year of the Trump administration alone, they bragged that over 2/3 of their Mandate for Leadership policy proposals were implemented just in year one under Trump. So there's every reason to take this seriously. There's every reason to think that this is exactly where the right is and where they want to take the country. And so people should be understand what that involves and what the stakes are.
Absolutely. And I think I'm going to put a pin in the sort of personnel thing, because the Venn diagram of MAGA Trump folks and the Heritage and Project 2025 being a circle is relevant. But first, I wanted to touch on some of the sort of the policy issues. And I think just to contextualize this Mandate for Leadership against past ones, even maybe, say, Trump administration in 2016, how have we seen Heritage and the MAGA movement, as they've become one amorphous blob, shift? I guess, are there notable changes in Project 2025 that we didn't see maybe the last time around?
Yeah, I would think one of the biggest changes that we did not see in the last time around and we see now is this idea of dismantling the quote administrative state. That's what they like to call basically career civil servants, people who work for, and they work for the government. They're policy experts, they're diplomats, they're people who process paperwork, et cetera. They're not political appointees who come and go with administrations. These are the people who just do the work of keeping the government running, interpreting policies, making recommendations, regardless of what administration's in charge. Now, during the first Trump administration, they didn't really have a solid plan other than chaos. And a lot of the things that they tried to do, these extremist staff members, these extremist members of this administration that came in with these really, really far right policy proposals that they sought to implement, they were stopped by people because of, frankly, they went against existing regulations. There were laws in place, there were policies in place that they couldn't fully implement the things that they wanted to implement. Now, we all remember how crazy the first Trump administration was and how chaotic it was and how extreme it was. Well, now what they've done is systematically gone through and figured out everything that got in their way from fully implementing their agenda the first time around and created a detailed plan on how to get around that. So that there is nothing obstructing their ability to fully implement their agenda. And one of the big ways that they're trying to do that is by getting rid of these career civil servants and stacking them with MAGA loyalists. This is a huge departure. This is not something that Heritage Foundation has ever done before, has ever talked about doing before, but it is key in their success in implementing this vision is to basically be able to stack all levels of the government with people who are loyal to this agenda so that there is nothing stopping them from implementing it.
Yeah, absolutely. So this, like, to think about like maybe parts of the plan itself, this is, say, getting rid of, like you say, civil servants and replacing them with political appointees, and doing that sort of wholesale, like large swaths of the federal government, if they're not getting rid of an agency completely, as they contemplate many times in Project 2025, right?
Yeah.
Putting those political appointees in place. What I want to ask real quick on this, though, because is this informed then by, like you said, there was the chaos of that first Trump administration. I think maybe one of the undersold parts of Project 2025 is there's a staffing component. Like, as I recall, and this has been downplayed even by Heritage since, but that like there was like a portal to like apply for jobs like in the next Trump administration. So it's like this from the beginning was conceived as a way to sort of fix the Trump administration problems of old. And I guess like you say, there's just no precedent for this, like that like a think tank would be the one staffing a presidential administration.
Yeah, this is, I mean, there's no precedent for it being this formal. I would say there's always a revolving door between think tank staffers and then incoming, if it's a conservative think tank, Republican administrations. And then when the Republicans are out of power, they go back to the think tanks. That revolving door always exists. But again, there's a difference between political positions that change with every administration. It doesn't matter who it is. If there's a Democrat in charge, there's a swath of positions that they can appoint, their political appointees to, implement and carry out their agenda. And then the same thing happens with the Republicans. What is different this time around, again, is that you have the Heritage Foundation that, to your point, they've got what they're calling kind of like a right-wing LinkedIn, where they had a goal of vetting and training tens of thousands of candidates to be able to, screen them for loyalty, to find, to have them go through. They had video trainings that they put in place for these potential applicants, so that they knew how to essentially get around FOIA requests and, things that like they can kind of hide their agenda, how to deal with the quote unquote administrative state, the people who are in there who are, just trying to do their job and do the job of just keeping the government running. They've got all sorts of like training materials with this job database where they are ready. And it's not that they're actually staffing the positions, but they have a list of candidates that they have vetted for every position that they think they could be open.
Absolutely.
So,
absolutely.
yeah, the administration can just come right in on day one and just start going through all those applications. They're right there ready to go, so they don't have to waste any time and they can just immediately start carrying out this plan.
Well, To that, and I think,
Mhm.
you mentioned this earlier, and the sort of the breadth of the linkage between the MAGA movement and the Trump campaign and
Mhm.
Project 2025 and the Heritage Foundation as it currently exists is wide and deep. And I guess just to start, though, we've seen in the last couple of months, especially Trump himself, but Republicans across the board try to distance themselves from Project 2025 as there's been more polling, right? As people learn more about it, the more they're like, whoa, I don't know about this.
Mhm.
So why is it that, I guess, let's start here, actually. How deep are the connections between, as we understand it, the sort of MAGA movement and I guess the Republican Party as it's been co-opted by the Trump movement in the last 8 years and Project 2025 slash the Heritage Foundation?
I mean, there's no daylight between them. So any efforts to try to pretend otherwise is just straight misinformation. It is completely false. So first of all, I think it's always a little bit of a tell when Trump tries to pretend he doesn't know somebody, because usually what'll happen is it'll come right out that like not only does he know them, he knows them quite well. That is definitely the case with Kevin Roberts, who's the head of the Heritage Foundation, and the one who put out and he wrote the forward for Project 2025. They know each other well. When he was appointed to take over the Heritage Foundation a few years ago, Trump gave the keynote address at their leadership conference in April of 2022. He praised Heritage Foundation and Kevin Roberts specifically for laying out the groundwork and detailed plans for everything that the MAGA movement was going to do. As far as Project 2025 and the mandate for leadership itself, at least 140 people who are tied to the Project 2025 and the mandate worked for the Trump administration. And 31 out of 38 of the core writers, so the people who actually wrote the chapters of the mandate for leadership, all but 7 of them are tied to the Trump administration. They either worked directly for his administration or they were on his transition team when he initially took office. And the other thing that I say is that you want to look closely at other key people who are part of the Trump administration who are like closely tied to, if not like a direct author of Project 2025. Not the least of it is Russell Vogt. He was the head of the Office of Management in budget during the Trump administration. He was the one who drafted the executive order called Schedule F that Trump implemented his last few weeks of office, that would have given him the ability to like mass wholesale fire all of these civil servants. That was Russell Vogt. He did that when Trump was in office the first time around. And, this was something that Biden promptly undid when he took office. But that is where the foundation of this lies. He is a key architect of the mandate for leadership. He is also part of the Trump campaign. He is the person that they put in charge of drafting the Republican national policy. He is also the man who is drafting the 180-day game plan to implement Project 2025 should Trump take over. This is somebody who has caught on camera bragging to people who he thought were donors about how he spends 80% of his time dealing with all of the administrative things that I was mentioning before, coming up with the executive orders for every single department of government to start to be able to implement this agenda, to drafting memos that the secretaries that they would appoint, say the Secretary of State or the Attorney General, that they would be sending out, around implementing this stuff. He's doing all of this stuff now so that he can be ready for when Trump takes office. And he's very open about the fact that Trump knows all about this and is fully on board. And I think that's the other thing is that, the people involved, Kevin Roberts, the head of the Heritage Foundation, Russell Vogt, they are pretty clear that Trump knows and that he's only distancing himself now for political reasons. They say that he's distancing himself from the brand, but the policies he's on board with and fully intends to implement. So I think we should take them at their word. This is what they plan on doing. The overlaps between the Trump administration is clear. Any suggestion otherwise is just an attempt to misinform and deflect attention away from what is really, really deeply unpopular policy proposals that would impact the vast majority of Americans, no matter what their politics. So it's important to take all that seriously.
Yeah, very, very much. Management wants you to find the difference between these two pictures. They're the same picture. So I think one of the things that we hear a lot, I think when in the progressive sphere, especially, right, when people talk about Project 2025, it's that if you start telling people everything that's in Project 2025, it starts bouncing off of them because they're like, well, there's no way that that could actually happen. And I guess let's tackle that head on. What are the ways in which, yeah, actually this could all happen if they really wanted it to?
Yeah, I think that is a very real concern, and that is something that, frankly, benefits the MAGA movement and the architects of Project 2025. Is that it is so expansive and so extreme that it's overwhelming to hear all of it in one shot, and it is really easy to turn your head and be like, "There's no way." I think that one of the things to keep in mind is that a lot of this, like, they're already trying to implement on the local level. So you don't have to look much further than Florida, for instance, and Ron DeSantis's administration, and a lot of the things that he has done in that state to try to eliminate conversations about race, conversations about LGBTQ individuals, rollback, like wholesale rollbacks of transgender rights. That is all stuff that is like widely nationalized in Project 2025. So I think the easiest way to boil it down, if you just wanted to give people the top lines, is that this agenda is all about control. It is ironic that it comes from a party who claims to be champions of limited government when all that it is wanting to control very huge aspects of your life. It wants to control, like, there are strict definitions of who it is that can be married. There are strict definitions about what women's role is, which is primarily just to have children and raise children. And outside of that, they don't have a lot of other worth. They want to restrict your ability to make decisions about your own healthcare. They want to restrict access to needed medications, whether you're a woman, whether you're transgender. They want to control what your doctor is allowed to say to you and prescribe for you to treat various different conditions that you may have. And so it goes on and on. So really, it's an agenda about control. It's about the government invading and taking over some of the most private aspects of your life. And it's just something that people should just be aware of and be able to contrast, with what your values are and what freedoms that you're advocating for, that run contrary to what this like vision looks like.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess just to dig into some of that, I think,
Sure.
and to contextualize maybe like how we got to this moment too, because I think part of Project 2025 happening in 2025, right, is the sort of lead up to that point. And I think specifically of the way that Trump has sort of staffed the Supreme Court in particular
Mhm.
with sort of conservative loyalists who have done the work of dismantling whatever legal frameworks they need out of the way to do some of this stuff. And I think obviously the big one is Roe v. Wade, obviously,
Right.
but it's also not littler things, but we'll call them more boring things to the average American. I think of the
Mhm.
Chevron deference case from this year, right, where
Mhm.
they got rid of the sort of legal precedents that they made it easier for judges to overrule the administrative state, right, quote unquote, over regular regulations, right? And
Right.
so now, in that context, with Chevron gone, that makes it easier for Project 2025 or a Trump administration staffed by Project 2025 folks to do some of these things, right? I guess to what extent, to quote a famous politician, does everything exist in the context of which it exists and all that came before? Um,
Well, I think with Chevron, I think that is a really good a recent Supreme Court ruling to point out about how this would help to implement this agenda, but also protect against people who were running contrary to this agenda. So what I mean by that is, I would think that, frankly, if they're able to execute their plan, where they come in, they get rid of tens of thousands of civil servants, they stack the government with these MAGA loyalists who then start like giving, the policy recommendations that the far right is like advocating for. Any of those challenges, like if anybody from, like, say, Democratic state AGs tried to challenge at those interpretations and those rules and those regulations, they're going to run into like a roadblock with the courts at this point, because they've got the Supreme Court so firmly in their pocket around any of this stuff. And then on the flip side, if there's a Democratic administration in charge, they have pathways to challenge every single thing that a Democratic administration tries to do now through the courts. So there are certain circuit courts that are well known for being very conservative. There's Republican AGs that have challenged all manners of things related to the Biden administration already. This Chevron deference just gives them the opening to go to a favored court, to go to a favored right-wing judge, get the ruling that they want, and then there's not much you can do to stop it at that point, depending on the pathway that it takes or depending on how extreme it is. We've seen that the Supreme Court is pretty reluctant at this point to impose any restrictions on what is the right-wing agenda, but they certainly would have no problem imposing restrictions around, more liberal policies. So I think that's a real serious consideration, and it's something that, unfortunately, not to be like a downer here, but it honestly doesn't really matter who's in which administration it is. They have it set up so that they can either advance the positions that they want to advance without obstruction, or obstruct any positions that they don't want. It's just kind of a heads we win, tails you lose situation, and that's with the courts right now. And that is something that should be discussed and I think more widely understood.
Yeah, certainly. I think we've all learned this lesson that elections matter, and maybe
Yes.
none more so than 2016. A lesson we continue to learn all the time.
Every day.
Yeah.
Every day.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, I guess to this point, I guess, and just to let's close out on this subject on this, I guess, is that there is simply a legal, political, and regulatory framework that exists now that did not exist, say, in 2016, that makes something like, let's just get rid of the Department of Education possible, more real, in a way that simply wouldn't have been possible in 2017, for instance.
Right. I think that's exactly right. I think what we have seen on the right is that they have really put in a lot of time and energy in being able to, again, dismantle the things that got in their way of advancing their agenda in 2016 and put the pathways in place so that they can, implement this like far right extremist vision for this country, which really takes us backwards, quite significantly backwards, in terms of policies. And they have this ability now to be able to more effectively implement it than they would have been able to in 2016. That doesn't mean all hope is lost. Don't get me wrong. There's plenty of things that people can do to fight back. But it is something that it is not the same environment that we are in 2016. We have a benefit of like 4 years of a Trump administration to understand that when they say they want to do this stuff, they fully intend on doing it. So I think this is like not the time to be naive. While it might be easy to dismiss that somebody's just saying something or that's so extreme, there's no way that they could actually do it. I would say that people should be very aware that no, there is a way to do it, and they do mean what they say. So all the more reason to be out there educating people about what the stakes are, what the right's vision for this country is, and things that they can do to push back against it.
Yeah, and I guess finally, because you just reminded me of this, is that the sense in which like there's the gut reflex to be like, oh, there's no way that could actually happen. I should pretty be easily challenged by what happened with Roe, where I mean, it doesn't. Everyone, lots of folks were saying, well, there's no way the Supreme Court gets rid of Roe v. Wade. And then it happened. And so I think now to have these conversations, not only about Project 2025, but say like all of the other Supreme Court cases that matter quite a lot to quite a lot of people, say, for instance, gay marriage or access to contraception, all stuff protected by Supreme Court cases and nothing else. So is there a sense that like, it's not that we're necessarily there's like a Chicken Little situation, but it's about contextualizing like, no, all of this can happen because it has happened. Don't forget that it already has happened. Yeah.
Right, exactly. That's what I think is, we live in such a fast-paced news world. All of us, are just out there living our lives. We're very busy with our own things going on. I think it's easy for a lot of people who, maybe not like you or I have to, think about this stuff every day, all day, to kind of lose sight about that we have been through this already. Like there is 100% concrete things you can point back to say this is 100% something that they plan on doing. They've done it. We can all just have to look at Roe to see that this is a goal, and no matter what seems too extreme for people that they would never do, they would do. And so, yeah, I think some general advice too I have about talking to people to kind of get around some of this reluctance, or just kind of getting overwhelmed by information and then just kind of tuning out, is just to kind of zone in on what's important to the person that you're talking to or the community that you're talking to, and stick to a few key things that Project 2025 wants to do that would impact that community or that person or that person's values. Don't try to overwhelm them with everything at once. Stick to a few basic things and then say, this is it. We know that they've done this. Look at what happened with Roe. This is 100% where they're planning on going on XYZ other issues. And then say, if you think this is bad, just let me tell you that everything else in this proposal is just as extreme, as it touches on every aspect of our life, from the Department of Justice to education, to immigration, to civil rights, to reproductive health, you name it. It's all very extreme. But to try to keep, when you're talking to people, just keep it narrow around the things that they care the most about.
Well, excellent advice. And I guess just to close out, is there anything that I didn't ask you that you still wanted to say?
Oh, no, I think we covered a lot of great ground, and I really appreciate the ability to come on and talk with you guys today.
Absolutely. Well, then we'll leave it there. Julie Millican, Vice President of Media Matters for America, thanks so much for being on Out in Front.
Thank you.
And that does it for this week's episode of Out in Front. If you missed today's live stream, you can always catch replays of this week's stream and every episode of the show on our Facebook and YouTube pages. That's facebook.com/Battleborn Progress and @Battleborn Progress on YouTube. For Battleborn Progress, I'm your host, Jacob Solis. Thanks so much for watching Out in Front. We'll see you in 2 weeks.